This is Gemara Baba Basra Daf Peiches. All the learning for this month. The month of Elul has been generously sponsored as a Schos Aliyas Neshama for us to Rizal Basra מאיר B'siyata Deshmaya. The learning the entire Chabura should bring as Rizal Basra מאיר to higher and higher place in Gan Eden Shalmayla, closer to the Kisei HaKavod B'siyata Deshmaya. We pick it up from on the top of Peiches and Aleph, and we're in the middle of trying to figure out what exactly is the precise case in the Mishnah of this child that shows up with his own flask to buy something from the store owner. So says the Gemara, 3 lines from the bottom, with a new inventive pshat, Ella Amar Rava. And of course, we know anytime the Gemara uses the word Ella, that means we remove all preconceived notions and we have a new pshat. So says the Gemara, Lama Rava, Ani, I, Varisha V'chabura, and the lion in our group, Tergaminu, explain the Mishnah. The Gemara interjects for a moment, and the Gemara says, who is that lion, Umanu, and who is that? Rav Zera. Hachba Mayaskinan. That what is the case talking about? Kion Shanala Lamed Baleh Cheirim, or 6 lines down, Bechas Amid Aleph. The storekeeper took the flask from this child to measure for la'achirim, for someone else. So now we see something interesting going on over here. It's true that if it's for this one person, it would be a different story. But says Rav Zera, says the Arisha Chabura, we have a unique case that the storekeeper takes this flask from the child and he's now using it for someone else. Essentially doing what? Ubishayel shaloi midas. He's borrowing this item without permission. He never asked the father whether he could use the flask for his own purpose, as the storekeeper is using to measure it with it for someone else. Says the Gemara, and therefore, kamliflagi, that is the machlaikas between Rav Yehuda and the Chachamim. Mar Savar, Rav Yehuda holds that what is the status of a shal shlei midas? Shoyel have, he's a borrower. Umar Savar, and the Chachamim hold that a shal shlei midas, gazlan have, is considered a gazlan. So that is the underpinnings of the Mishnah, which of course comes up very interesting, that hidden within the simple innocuous case of our Mishnah is seemingly discussing a case of utilizing a flask. Really, there's another entire machlekes going on, in that we're debating what is the status of a shayel shaloi midas. Says the Gemara, Gufa, let's go back to the din of Shmuel from yesterday's daf. Gufa Amar Shmuel. What did Shmuel teach us? For 6 lines in the white lines. Someone takes a kli from the uman lebakrai to look at it. He wants to inspect the item. He wants to see, is this indeed something he wants to buy? And in the process, an oines happens. An oines, not a pshia. He didn't do anything wrong. It slips from his hand or something of the sort. What is the din? Says Shmuel v'chayiv. V'hani mili, says the Gemara, this is when udekitze damel, says only when there is a fixed price to the item. Because there's a fixed price, it's not that there's going to be negotiations. It's not that we're going to be handling the price, but rather if he wants to buy it, he's just going to tell the store owner, the seller, that he wants to buy it. And that is the reason why that we're considering it, that the moment that he picks it up, it's considered to be a kinyan, and therefore v'nenas biyada, even though it was an oines, he's going to be chayiv. Explains the Gemara, a story of Gavra to all lebei tabcha. There was someone who went into the butcher shop, agaba atma de Basra, and he picked up a piece of meat. It was a piece of meat from the atma de Basra, the thigh. Bahadid ka'agba, as he's picking it up, what happened? Also, parsha marma minei, As he was picking it up, a horseman came, a parsha, and he grabbed it from him. So he's picking it up to look at the piece of meat. And unbeknownst to him, some bad guy walks into the store and grabs the meat from him. He comes before Rav Yemar and he says, Chayvei l'shalmei demei. Says Rav Yemar, you were holding the item when this guy grabbed it from you. You are liable. It says the Gemara, but again, like we just said in the din of Shmuel, Vani Mili, what? Udekitze dameh. This is precisely only if there is a set price. If there is a set price, just like the din of Shmuel, therefore, there were not going to be any negotiations of the sort, but rather, one just had to decide whether he wanted to purchase it. Therefore, we consider the act of picking it up to be a kinyan, and even though it was an eines, he's going to be chayiv. Another story in the first white line of Ugaver Daisi Kare Lepom Nara. There was a person who brought a kara, a gourd, to Pom Nara to sell it. Asli Kuli Alma Shakal Kara. And what happened? Everyone came and took gourds. Everyone just started grabbing them to buy them. Amar Lahu. So the seller said, Harehain Mukdashim L'Shamayim. What happened over here was that people started grabbing the gourds without paying. And the seller is left trying to figure out who owes him money. So the seller says, you know what? All the gourds are mukdash, are sanctified and consecrated la shamayim. Asa l'kamei d'Rav Kahana. And of course, he did this because he didn't get paid and he wanted to make sure that these guys aren't going to benefit from his items. So he comes before Rav Kahana and Amr Lahu. Rav Kahana says to them, Ein Adam Makdish Davar Sheinei Shalai. Says Rav Kahana, it's very nice that you wanted to give it to the Hektish, but Lamaisa, they're not yours, and therefore you're not able to be Makdish them at this point. So we see Mamish, the same thing that we were talking about, that once one picks it up, he has a kinyan on the item, and again, the Gemara makes the same caveat, Vanimilu dekitza dameha. It's only if there was a set price of lokitzi dameha, then versus marayu kaimi v'shaber akdish, then it would stay in the rishus of the owner, and he could be makdish it. Again, because there's a set price, we consider that when the potential buyer picked up the item, it's considered automatically to be his. Another story proving the din of Shmuel. Says the Gemara, Tanu Rabbanan, a little bit of a segue, but as we'll see, very related to this din that we're discussing, when you could make a kinyan on an item whilst buying it. Tanu Rabbanan lakech yerek min hashok ubirer v'hiniach afilu kol hayoim kula Elohi kanav l'nechayev v'maiser. Says the rice of someone is buying yerek min hashok, vegetables, ubirer v'hiniach, and he took the ones he wanted and he put them aside. Afilu kol hayoim kula. What's the din? Loi kana. There's no kinyan on the item. V'loin is chayev v'maiser, and therefore there is no chiyav in maiser. What's the reason? Because since he's going through vegetable after vegetable, just finding the right ones, keeping on selecting and sorting nicer and nicer, therefore there's no das to be kaina. But let's say a bit of his mind that he indeed wanted to make a kinyan. Then what is the halacha? Kana, then there is a kinyan. But the problem is, what happens? Later on, he says, nah, you know what? I don't want that item. So says the Gemara, Lachzira yevsher. If he wants to return it, it's not possible. Shekvan is chayiv meiser, because he already had a chayiv meiser, so he can't just give it back. V'la'asra yevsher. And if now he wants to take off meiser and then return it, he also can't do it. Why? Shkvar mavchitan b'damim. The reason being, because when you take off meiser, it goes down in value. So this guy is stuck between a rock and a hard place. What can he do? If he wants to return the item, he takes a meiser, and then he has to give the seller the value of the meiser that he took off. Asks the Gemara, Atumisham, the Gemara believe with Liknoisai Kanav in his Chayv and Meiser. Says, I don't understand this whole thing. Because he decided he wants the item at that moment, there's a kinyan, and he's obligated a Meiser. Rav Hoshia, yes. Hacha b'yarei shamayim askinon. We're dealing with the Yari Shamayim, ki goin Rav Safra, the Kayim ben Avshei, v'dover emes, bil vavoy. Talking about a high-level person, not just that he talks emes. He talks emes bil vavoy in his heart. And therefore, the moment that he decided that he wanted to keep it, indeed, there is the obligation, and that is the reason why you would not be able to return it without taking off Meiser, like we learned at the end of the Brisa. We continue into the Mishnah, the final Mishnah on this parak, which goes into different dinim of buying and selling, most notably the weights of a storekeeper, etc. Hasitoin mikaneach midaisav achas l'shleishim yom. A wholesaler has to wipe down his weights 1 in 30 days. Valabayis achal sheimas chodesh. A balabayis wipes down his weights 1 in 12 months. Weights that you use to measure a liquid, etc., therefore get dirty and could skew the measurements. And therefore, because a sitoin, a wholesaler, sells very commonly, therefore it gets dirtier, more residue more quickly, and therefore it has to be cleaned out once in 30 days. A balabayis, on the other hand, once in 12 months suffices. 3 lines from the bottom, Rashba Goimer, Chilav Advarim, he switch around the names. And of course we have to understand why. Storekeeper, frequent business, wipes down his weights twice a week. And he wipes down his weights once a week. He writes down the scale. I'll call mishkal umishkal between each and every week. He has to wipe down the scale. These are all by liquid items that are sold and measured. Avol biyavesh. But if it's a dry item, einai. If it's a dry item, then einai tzarech, then it's not necessary. And similarly, continues the Mishnah, one of the sellers is obligated to tilt in the favor of the buyer. He has to potentially give him a little bit more up until a tefach. Let's say if he's weighing for him with a balance scale, then you don't give an extra tefach, but rather what do you give him? Give him an extra measure. And this extra measurement that is given is 1 in 10 of moist items. Concludes the Mishnah, place where they measure with small measurings, don't use large. In a place in which the minhag is to measure level, they normally measure heaped, don't measure leveled off, and this all has to do with what is the norm in each location. Says the Gemara, the din on top of this amud by tilting the scale in favor of the buyer. Asks the Gemara, Minani Mili, where does this come from? Amrei Shlakish Tamar Kraven Shlema V'Tzedek Sedek Avet Shlema V'Tzedek, a perfect and just weight. Sedek Sadik Mishalcha V'Ten Loi, and this teaches us to over cautious that one has to be, that you should tilt, you should act of your own and give it to the buyer. Ask the Gemara if this is true. But says the Gemara, I don't understand. But if we just learned that the tilt of the scale in favor for the buyer is a din da'araisa, how is there ever in this case of measuring out perfectly precisely? The Torah taught you have to give a little bit more for the buyer. Explains the Gemara, that's the minhag in the Reisha. But if in the Seifa it's different minhag, that's fine. Itmar. When the Reish Lakish says then it was on the Seifa. That what? From where do we know that then? That you have to give the extra Gerum and the extra Telt. Excuse me. V'tzedek. For there we darsh it. Tzadik mishalcha v'ten loy. Says Gemara, okay, and how much is this? Belach la'asara litrin. Says Rav Abba Bar Mamul, 1/10 of a liter per 10 litras, when we're talking about liquid measurements. We continue with the next din in the Mishnah that said, Ech lasar belach, v'echel eshem b'yavesh. Ibayalu asked the Gemara, what exactly is it meant? What did the Mishnah mean? What did the Mishnah mean when it says 1 in 10 in the case of lach? La'asar b'lach, per every 10 in lach. And what does it mean? That's one way to learn it. Do we say that it means 1/10 of a litra for liquids per 10, and similarly 1/20 of a litra for every 20 in dry? Or does it mean 1/10 of a litra per 10 of liquid and per 10 of dry? And the question basically is this echad v'asara specifically to liquids by yavish is not or not? Teku, says the Gemara, we have to wait for Eliyahu Hanavi for that one. And as we're on the topic of false weights, etc., the Gemara now delves a little bit deeper to teach us the severity of this Aveira. Amar Rabbi Levi, kasha einchin shal midais yaiser, mi einchin shal arayis. Midais have a larger punishment than that of arayis. Shazen Amar Bahen, by this one it says, by this one it says kel. By this one it says these issues. Zemar Nemar Bahem Ela. And by this one, when it comes to false weights, it says Ela. So says the Gemara, so we see that the first, when it comes to weights, is a more severe type of Aveira than when it comes to Arayis. Umay mashmad hayel kasha. Who says, how do you know that when the pasuk says el these is more kasha than ela? Tichsev es ele haaretz lokach, because the pasuk says that you should take from the ele, the strong ones of the land. Says I don't understand. Gabriel nami oksiv ele, but also says ele, which also is a pretty bad term. Says the Gemara, Olam ute midois mikares. That's coming to say that lemaisa midas doesn't get kares, but at some level it is a worse aveira. Says the Gemara, what everyone's wondering. What do you mean then? In what way is it worse? If you're going to tell me that it doesn't get kares, so why are you telling me that midas is worse? So explains the Gemara, the hasam efsher b'tshuva. The worst arayis, you can do tshuva, but v'hacha by false weights, lo efsher b'tshuva, there's no tshuva that could be done after cheating and tricking so many people out of their money. And we conclude with Vamar Rav Levi, 10 lines to the bottom, kasha gezel et yoisimi gezel gavaya. It's worse to steal from a person to steal from Hashem. Why? Because in the psukim, this one, the chait comes before the me'ilah, whereas this one, the me'ilah, comes before the chait. In a similar vein, this one can do tshuva to the Beis Hamikdash, but not to so many individual people. V'amar Rav Levi bar Reish like midas Kadosh Baruch Hu, midas basar b'da, Kadosh Baruch Hu beis Yal b'asim v'shtayim. Hashem gives us 22 brachos to kill him b'shmayna, and Hashem gives us 8 letters. Hashem bless us with the 22 letters of the Aleph place, and He curses us with 8 letters. What does that mean? Baruch and b'asim v'shtayim. That what me'im b'chukais adikam mi'ois. What does it mean to call him b'shmayna? Me'im b'chukais timasu ad v'aschukais galu nafsham. Ve'ilu. That's when it comes to the midas of Kadosh Baruch Hu. Filu Moshe Rabbeinu by the klala in this week's parshas Kisavai Perchan b'shmayna, and of course, always incredible when the daf coincides perfectly with the goings on, the parshas of Shavua, etc. Moshe Rabbeinu bercha b'shmayna klala b'asav v'shtayim. Baruch v'shamayna, what does that mean as you turn over to Pei Tes Amud Aleph, Mevayim Shamayad La'ovdom, Kilam V'esav Shayim, Mevayim Lo Shamayad Ve'ein Kaineh, the Midah of Kadosh Baruch Hu outweighing the Midah of Asr Dam. Pick it up from the top over here on Pei Tes Amud Aleph, and Mirza Hashem.